Education is preparation for reparation, yeah?
We're going to move straight over to our next speaker, who has woken up very early in the morning to do this because he is 6 hours behind in the USA. We're going to go to Associate Professor of American Studies, Kimani Nehusi from Temple University in the United States.
Good morning.
We can hear you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for unmuting me. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night to everyone, wherever we are. I want to begin by congratulating the organizers for putting on this very important occasion. I don't think it's necessary to stress the importance and significance of moments like these. And I will move straight on to say that it's personally a good thing for me to reconnect with some of the people who started this phase of African reparations movement in 1991, I think it was, with our first conference in Birmingham, organizing with Bernie Grant. So I take my hats off to those of us who have remained in this part of our struggle. I think it's also important to recognize that we meet in a moment in the history of the world when there are tectonic shifts taking place. The global South is beginning to organize itself against an international system that has been imposed upon all of us, and especially African people. And perhaps one of the most important questions is how African people could organize ourselves to take advantage of what is emerging as a new system of international alliances, a new way of being in the world. I want to restrict my remarks today to the three categories that have been given in the title of the conference. That is the meaning, the purpose, and the politics of our movement. Let me just say that perhaps the biggest thing in the meaning has got to be understanding ourselves. We pay correctly a lot of attention to history, our own history. But I believe that it is important for us to begin with an Afrocentric understanding of our reality. Our history as African people did not begin when Europeans erupted in our lives. Our history didn't begin when Arabs erupted in our lives before Europeans and also destroyed us. The history of our people began when history began, because we were the first human beings. We erected the first civilization. And if we wish to understand ourselves properly, then we have to relocate everything we're talking about in the entire history and culture of our people. If we don't, we risk not understanding, we risk being misguided, and we risk not doing ourselves the justice we demand. So, for me, the meaning of any gathering like this must be to reinforce that point. We have to correct and alleviate the atrocities of Arab and Western European invasion destruction and desecration of Africa, and the way in which African people and other peoples too regulated humanity's relationship with the planet, with the world, with Mother Earth. Let us be clear that Arabs, first of all, invaded and desecrated Africa, and then Europeans did the same thing. We tend to know more or to understand more about Western European invasion, the violent imposition of their own system upon us. But we must not forget any aspect of our history, and I call attention here again to the fact of Arab invasion and destruction of Africa. The system imposed by the Europeans, including imposed over Arab peoples also, is a system that has been described before. It delivers structured inequality based upon race, color, class, gender, and a number of other ways of categorizing human beings that have been introduced by Western Europeans. Much of these atrocities have been normalized. It's okay for people to make discriminatory judgments about us based upon who we are. It happens every day, it's regular. And part of our task is to understand how this happens and why. The purpose of reparations has got to be to repair the damage. I think this one is extremely logical, obvious. What is not so obvious most of the time, though, is what damages are we talking about? If we don't know what has happened to us, how we have suffered, and how we continue to suffer, which is an important aspect of this, then we are in no proper position to correct the damages. So part of our task, part of the purpose of our movement has got to be to define exactly, clearly, and totally the damages that we have suffered and we continue to suffer. This is a huge task, but we've got to do it. We've got to aim at repairing this damage for ourselves. Let's be clear, this is an act of self-liberation. Liberation is something only we could do for ourselves. We could have partners and so on, but we're the ones who've got to execute this. We've got to direct it. We've got to envisage it. We've got to plan it. We've got to restore our dignity. We've got to regenerate ourselves in every category that we could maybe reduce human existence to. You know, compartmentalization tends to reduce people. So we talk about economics sometimes as though that's unrelated to identity, for example. We're talking about a holistic existence, which is African tradition. We've got to repair the planet. I mean, here it is that African people had been living what we call today environmentalism from as far back as we could get. And we don't know this. Most of our people tend not to know this. Today, when you turn on the television and you hear about and see about environmentalism in Africa, it's invariably Europeans, some of them well-intentioned, who are talking about environmentalism. And if you see any Africans at all, they're in the background. Now, most of us don't recognize the atrocity, the indignity of such a representation or misrepresentation of our history and ourselves. So there are areas there, I mean, we could talk on end about how African people lived environmentalism through our culture, which we've been forced and persuaded to desert in increasing numbers. So for me, one of the most important purposes has got to be the restoration of African identity. Broadly speaking, that means our history and our culture. I don't need to stress that. Other speakers have done so already. So we've got to begin at our beginning to understand our own story. We've got to do it for ourselves. It's important that in doing this, we understand the significance, the tremendous significance of defining our own reality for ourselves. Permit me to give you one example of what I mean. It's popular for us to talk about slaves and African slaves and the African slave trade. There is nothing more inaccurate, ridiculous, and demeaning. This was a trade organized by Europeans for the benefit, substantially, of Europeans. There were some African traitors and misguided ones who benefited from the trade, and we need to understand that. But this was a European trade in our bodies, in our ancestors. So we got to call it by its name. We cannot depend upon our enemies, our abusers, to define reality for us. And let me say this. I always tell people that my ancestors were not slaves. They were enslaved Africans. And if we define our ancestors correctly, we will therefore include the unending resistance that they engaged in. Resistance that resulted in revolutions. 1763 in Berbice, in Guyana. 1791 to 1804 and after in Haiti. We've got to understand these things as they were. When we use the word slave, we exclude that. Whose job are we doing? We're doing the job of the enslavers. They don't want us to know that our ancestors resisted and resisted from the inception and resisted gloriously. And there are many other terms we use that obscure rather than reveal our reality. So I think we've got to pay attention to that. We talk about African Renaissance. Renaissance is something that happened in Europe, using African knowledge to renew themselves. Why should we say Renaissance when we have Sankofa and terms in other African languages that we could use? These are some of the questions that face us. Let me talk briefly, before I end, about the politics. And I think some of this ought to be evident. It's a politics of self-liberation. For some people, self before liberation is kind of redundant, because only we could free ourselves. But Marley said only we could free our minds. It's the same thing in any kind of freedom. The mind is strategic, most important. So, the objective of our politics has got to be African liberation. And it's got to be that we must do this for ourselves. It doesn't mean that we must exclude allies and partners and so on. But we've got to be very clear that our allies, our partners are not us. We're the ones who've got to direct and lead our own struggle. Nobody else must be permitted to colonize our struggle. As happened in South Africa, we've got to learn from that. It's informed African people who got to plan, strategize, and execute our struggle. Let me insist on this, that informed Africans, because it's only when we have all the facts, or most of the relevant facts, and a clear understanding that we could make the best decisions on ourselves. And this is an insistence on knowing who we are, our identity, and knowing our history. We don't have to know every detail. We just got to understand the overall trajectories of our history. And we've got to promote people, scholars, activist scholars, who will continuously research and produce the relevant knowledge and understanding of our history. Ancient Egyptian language, Medu Neche, is strategic. We don't know much about the first details, the earliest details we have about ourselves. The models and examples that our people organized and lived 7,000 and more years ago in the ancient Nile Valley will surprise many of us. We don't know, we tend to know about the Greeks and the Romans, who would come thousands of years after and copy from us. So it's important that we understand ourselves in these ways. We also need organization. We could get nowhere without proper organization, disciplined organization. We need to mobilize ourselves. It's no use we have 10 or whatever number of scholars and activists, and we don't go into our communities, raise awareness, promote organization, so that when we move together in large numbers. We mobilize. And we need a permanent mobilization. We need an ideology to guide us, and that ideology could only be Pan-Africanism with African socialism, if I might call it so in crude terms. You know, taking back our ancestors' understanding of ourselves. We also need to build eventually a people's organization, an African people's organization that will guide and lead our movement. We must promote tactical and strategic understanding, actions, decisions about our own struggle. Finally, there are some questions that ought to be self-evident and we must be very clear about, as well as the answers to these. One is, who controls the process of African liberation? The resounding answer is educated Africans, and I don't mean educated by people who got PhDs and blah, blah, blah. I mean people who understand, who know our struggle and understand it. And above all, the involvement of African people, the so-called ordinary African people, is paramount. If our movement is restricted in its leadership and in its general membership to any one section of our people, and most especially if it excludes or minimizes the interest, the participation of the vast majority of our people, then we are traitors to our own liberation. So I end by saying Pan-Africanism now, Africa for Africans, liberation now. It's a process. And the earlier we start, the more we do, the clearer our path will be. Thank you very much.
Education is preparation for reparation, yeah?